Hey guys, welcome back to The Bright Side. Macy here, The Bright Side Girl, and today I'm going to be talking about my top 10 books of 2024. So these are going to be my top reads of the year, my all-time favorite reads. These are books that I read in 2024, not new releases, although a couple new releases did make the list. This is one of my favorite videos to do every year. So far, I have been able to condense it down to 10 to 12 books. I've got a couple honorable mentions I'm going to squeeze in. Even though I read a large portion of books, I haven't found it overly hard to compile this list yet. I'm still waiting for that like insane year where I have like 30 favorite books of all time. Maybe we can hit that in 2025. But for now, I'm going to go in and talk about these books. I'm not going to necessarily do these in any order, but I am going to save like my very top favorites for the very end of the video. All right, I have two honorable mentions. One is going to be Listen for the Lie by Amy Tintera. This is one I only gave like a 4 or a 4.5 star, partially because I wasn't overly thrilled with the final ending wrap up, but the overall experience of this one was a 5 star. Like, it was such an enjoyable read. I listened to it so quickly. I did this one on audiobook. The narrator was absolutely incredible. This one's about a woman returning to her hometown that she hasn't visited in a while because her best friend was murdered when she was younger, and I believe a lot of people suspect that she was the murderer, but nothing ever happened with it. So she doesn't really like going home because there's some like weird energy there just with the death, things revolving around her. Her friend was very like lively and fun, and she was a little bit more like sarcastic and darker in spirit. So with this book, what was really neat, there's this podcaster that is pretty famous, and he is unearthing this particular murder and trying to kind of go through it and maybe even possibly finally solve this case. He winds up tracking her down, and they wind up kind of working together. There's so many different elements in this book that I really enjoyed. The podcasting elements have podcasting like effects to them. Like, you can hear them with phone calls and changes of voice when they're on the radio, and it just had different like sound elements that were really, really cool. Also, one of my favorite parts about this book is that it was kind of a humorous, dark read because our main character is getting feedback from the voices in her head, and it's making you think that maybe she really was the killer, and you're trying to solve it along with her because she's not even entirely sure. The voice in her head is very dark and intense and telling her to do things all the time, and so she's kind of dealing with that throughout the podcast. Is such an interesting element of the podcast. There's a little romance in here that I really liked. The wrap up wasn't quite as good as I wanted it to be, but it was still fine, and I enjoyed the experience so much that I wanted to mention this one in my favorites video. All right, next was The Forest Grimm by Catherine Purdy. This is a young adult kind of cozy fairy tale style fantasy read, and I really love this one. I read this one for Retoldathon. If I read any of these books for any like reading vlogs or any other videos, I will link them all down below, so make sure you check out that description. But I know I read this one for a Retoldathon because this one ties in a bunch of different fairy tales. So years ago in this world, their villagers whispered their deepest desires to the book, and its pages would reveal how to obtain them. All was well until somebody used the book for an evil purpose to kill another person. Afterward, the branches of the Forest Grimm snatched the book away, and Grimm's Hollow started to turn rancid, and the crops died from disease. The villagers tried to make amends, but every time somebody crossed their borders, they would never return. Despite the warnings from her fortune-telling grandmother, Clara decides to embark on this journey, solve the mystery of her missing mother, and find this missing book. This was so magical. It does feel slightly on the younger YA side than some of our other fantasy reads. There's a cute little friendship romance in here, but I really in particularly loved while they are going through the forest, they are encountering different people that have to do with different fairy tales. So like Cinderella and Sleeping Beauty, it reminded me very much of The Brothers Grimm, the movie. It's like a super old movie with like Matt Damon. And so they're encountering these different fairy tales, people, and figuring out like how they came to be and why the book was taken and all these different things. So there's multiple different fairy tales mentioned and talked about in here, and I just thought it was so well written. I loved the forest. I loved the elements. I really liked the ending of the book as well. So this one was a 5 star. It didn't quite make my top 10, but it came really close. I also briefly wanted to talk about Spectacular by Stephanie Garber. This also makes my honorable mentions. This is a cozy Christmas fantasy novella in the Carval world. Please read Caraval, the entire trilogy, before you read this one. This is a novella that goes with the series. It will spoil the entire series if you haven't read it. I see so many people wanting to read this without reading Caraval. You will not enjoy it because you won't understand what's happening and you don't have an attachment to the characters. This is like a Christmas love letter to Caraval fans. It is magical fantasy goodness. We need so many more Christmas fantasy books. There really are not that many, especially in YA, and this was just like the perfect love letter to the fans. I didn't want to put it on my top 10 because it is a novella, and while I just absolutely loved it, I didn't feel like it quite bumped out those other books. I do have 2 copies out because it is Christmas time. The illustrations in this one are one of the best parts, so I do recommend physically reading it. However, I physically read it and did the audio because I wanted to see all the pretty illustrations. But the audio is also done by Rebecca Solar, who's pretty much my favorite narrator, and she's incredible. There's also sweet little sound effects and things, and they're done really well. This is what I mean when I want like a graphic audio, is the spectacular book, because it's just done so incredibly well. So definitely check this out in the Christmas season after you've read the Caraval books. All right, next up, I'm just putting this entire series on here because I enjoyed it so much more than I expected to, and that is the Diabolic series by S.J. Kincaid. In particular, Empress was the one that made the top 10, which is book 2, but the whole series belongs rightfully on this list. So I read this one for Galaxy-a-thon because it kind of has a space fantasy element to it. We're in this world where there are these diabolics, which are basically like advanced android AI robots that look and talk human. You can also use them as bodyguards. They become kind of like a pet or like part of the family. They become illegal in this world, but one wealthy family decides to keep theirs and pass her off as human. So the power-hungry emperor of this galaxy learns of a rebellion that he thinks is led by Sidonia's parents, who are the ones hiding this diabolic. He summons her to the galactic court, but instead they send the diabolic in her place as her. She is a ruthless killing machine. These diabolics are extremely strong, powerful, and cold, and you are basically in her head throughout most of the book, which I could feel like for some people they may not enjoy that. I loved it. I did the audiobook. The narrator was, again, absolutely phenomenal. So good. And you're like following her along as she's going through the world and basically trying to protect Sidonia, who is back home, and pretend to be her. And then there's a romance that occurs. There are a lot of politics and intrigue. It very much reads in between, kind of like a dystopian fantasy space book. I would say the spacey elements are less than the dystopian and the fantasy elements. We have a lot of royalty in here. I loved the romance that developed. It was like gut-wrenching, angsty goodness. So good. Lots of plot twists that I didn't expect, and I just really enjoyed this. I just felt like it was such a solid series. I was just so impressed by it. It just kind of grabbed a hold of my heart. So I absolutely loved this entire series, but especially book 2. By the way, I own a lot of these books, but because the shelves are turned backwards and they weren't on my TBR, they're somewhere in the madness, so we're just using the pictures for now. So next up is The Lake House by Sarah Beth Durst. I read this one for Hike-a-thon, so I'll link that vlog down below. This one is a little bit of a thriller, but probably leans more towards the mystery side. It has very, very minor horror elements because it is kind of a slightly spooky read. I didn't find it like truly terrifying or like overly intense. It's definitely not like crazy gory or anything. I loved it so much, and it had so many good elements. So we're following Claire, and she kind of grew up double checking locks, counting her steps, and second guessing every decision. She's just got a worst case scenario type mind. It's how she's wired. But the worst case scenario never actually happens until she arrives at her off-grid summer camp to find a black and burnt husk instead of a lodge. There are 2 other girls that have also arrived, and they have been dropped off, and it's a little bit of a walk to get to this cabin, and by the time they get there, the person that dropped them off is gone, and there are no people around, no place to hide, and they basically have to stay on this island until they become picked back up. There's no cell phone service, so it becomes this kind of epic survival story, but also they're trying to unsolve the mystery, and they feel like someone or something is with them on the island, watching them and following them. It is so good, and what I really loved about this one is one of the twists was fantastic. 2, the girls instead of like going against each other and becoming really catty and extreme, which happens a lot in these survival reads that I love, they kind of became closer and bonded together and became a real team of like sisterly empowerment, which I thought was really, really fabulous. This is a young adult novel that has so many different elements. I just so enjoyed this one. I thought it was great. Don't let the spooky cover scare you too much. It's got a little bit of creepy elements, but nothing like truly scary, and it's just such a good one. I listened to The Lake House on audio as well. Once again, the narrator was absolutely amazing. Next, we have One by One by Ruth Ware. I actually was gonna leave this book off because I only gave it a 4 or a 4.5 star. However, this is one of those books that I have recommended, talked about, and thought about through the entire year. And I think quite a few of you actually read it for Jingle Bellathon and felt kind of the same way. So I feel like I deserved a solid spot on this list. This was my first Ruth Ware book. She is an adult thriller mystery writer. I'm kind of picky with those books. When they're good, they're amazing, but I have like certain things that I want. I don't like to delve too much into the past of the characters and go into like the trauma and the grief. I want to be in the action of the story and solving the mystery. So far, Ruth seems to do that really well. So this one is so unique. I loved it so much. I liked all the different elements. This one is set in a ski lodge in the French Alps, and we're following this high-tech company that is having like a retreat slash meeting for the future of their company. We have this whole group of very particular characters that all have different goals for the company in mind, and then we're also following two people that work at the lodge. These big snowstorm blizzards come in and they get shut off from the outside world. They get shut off of power and they have to try to find a way to survive, which is already bad enough because we're with all these kind of spoiled, wealthy, app techie type people, plus the people that work at the lodge. And then people start dying one by one. And so things get even more extreme. So we're solving that mystery while we're surviving. The atmosphere in this one is incredible. If you love like snowy, winter, cozy vibes, like yes, it's cozy even though it's intense because the atmosphere of the snow and the snowstorm and the blizzards and all that stuff is so good. But also I loved the app that they created. It had such a cool element to it and it was incorporated into the book really well. I did do this one on audio once again. I loved the narrator. She was so incredible. I thought the twists in this one were really good. I thought the ending was fairly solid as well, and it's one that I kind of constantly want to reread. I may even reread it this winter because I loved it so much. All right, next up was Dark Matter by Blake Crouch. This is an adult book I have been putting off. I actually started this one with my husband Jeff probably like 5 years ago on audiobook. It was one of the first kind of thriller, darker books that I have read. It's not really a thriller. I don't really know what category it would fall under. It's definitely like a sci-fi type read. And I got worried that it was going to get like too intense and too dark, and I didn't push through the beginning. Like nothing crazy even happened, but I got worried about it and we didn't finish it. And then the show came out and my mom was watching the show and I knew she was gonna like spoil it for me. So I decided to just throw it in, read it really fast. I'm so sad I didn't push through because I loved this so much and it was not as heavy and dark and scary or anything that I thought it was going to be. It was very different than what the story I had built up in my mind. So we're following Jason Dessen and he is walking through the streets one chilly night in Chicago, looking forward to a quiet evening in the fireplace with his wife, Daniela, and their son, Charlie. Then his reality is shattered. Are you happy with your life? Those are the last words Jason hears before his masked abductor knocks him unconscious. Then he awakens strapped to a gurney and surrounded by strangers in hazmat suits. And then a man Jason has never met stares down at him and says, "Welcome back, my friend." In this world, Jason has woken up. His life is not the one that he has known. His wife is not his wife. His son was never born. And Jason is not an ordinary college physics professor, but a celebrated genius who has achieved something remarkable, something impossible. You guys, this book is so good, and don't let the sci-fi-ness of it throw you off because there's actually a romance slash love story that happens in here that just really brings it all together. I loved it so much. I thought the ending was fabulous. It was a lot more of like a sweet emotional read, but it still had those very cool sci-fi elements and like multiple reality elements that make it super interesting. I still haven't watched the show and I really need to, and I really want to read some more from Blake Crouch now because I loved this one so much. I once again listened to Dark Matter on audio and the narrator for this one was so good. I feel like the good narrator always enhances the story, so can't recommend it enough. Next is An Enchantment of Ravens by Margaret Rogerson. This is a YA fae fantasy story. This is my first one from Margaret Rogerson. Enchantment of Ravens is another one that I did on audiobook. I did not physically read a ton of books this year. You guys will see it in my like stats wrap up that's coming soon. So most of these are going to be audiobooks. At one point, this was like my favorite read of the year. I read this one during Hikeathon once again. So we're following Isabel, and she is an artist. She has been set to commission a portrait for a dangerous set of clients, the fair folk. These immortal creatures cannot bake bread or put pen to paper without crumbling to dust. They crave the human craft with a terrible thirst, and they trade valuable enchantments for Isabella's painting. But when she receives her first royal patron, Rook the Autumn Prince, Isabel makes a deadly mistake and paints sorrow in his eyes, a weakness that could cost him his throne or his life. And the furious Rook spirits her away to his kingdom to stand trial for his crime. You guys, if you like fae books, this one is so good. It is different and it is slightly more simple than things like ACOTAR and Cruel Prince. I loved it so much. It is so ridiculously like charming, beautifully written. I loved the romance. It was such a fun, short, standalone fantasy to squeeze in, and it just charmed my socks off. I just absolutely loved it. Next we have Before the Devil Knows You're Here by Autumn Krause. Oh my gosh, you guys. I was so scared to read this book because I have been chatting a little bit with the author, who is just the sweetest. I love her Instagram account. She is gothic goodness in an author. I was so excited for this book based on like her promoting it and just other people, but I was so nervous because I was like, oh my gosh, if I don't like it, I'm gonna feel so bad because I've been so excited and I love the author. I read it and it was so good. It was everything I wanted, but also different than what I expected. So this is a short, standalone, young adult fantasy book. This is a loose kind of retelling, but mostly inspired by Johnny Appleseed and Paul Bunyan. Say less. We're in Wisconsin in the 1830s, and we're following Catalina, and she is left only with her little brother. Mama died years ago, and they buried Papa yesterday. She and Jose are alone now in the ramshackle cabin at the edge of the Wisconsin wilderness, with the cold weather coming. As Catalina sets a plan to ensure their survival, a strange man appears. A man covered in bark, leaves growing from his head, and sap dripping from his eyes. Before Catalina can stop him, he scoops up Jose and disappears. He leaves behind a strange bird with crimson wings, and she can't let this man, if that's what he is, have her brother. With no idea where they've gone, she tracks the bird in hopes of finding them. This was basically like a unique fairy tale gothic story. It does have those like gothic, slightly darker elements, but it was not really supposed to be like scary or too dark and creepy. We are also following the perspective of this man, so you're going back in time for how he became this like sap creature man, and future time where she is tracking him and her brother, and the stories are like slowly connecting together, and it is just so well written, so magical. If you liked like Forrest Grimm, it kind of has those vibes a little bit just because it's got the darker wilderness, but the gothic atmosphere is so good. I'm so excited that it made my top 10 this year. Next is a last minute edition that totally surprised me, and that was The Most Wonderful Crime of the Year by Ally Carter. A Christmas book. Made my top 10. I love it when this happens because I absolutely adore Christmas and holiday books, but they don't always make the top 10 because they're just kind of silly and fun and cute, and this one is all those things and a little bit more. So this one is like a mystery thriller romance. It's adult, it's epic. I did this one on audio. Once again, narrator amazing. I would recommend you do this on audio because the narrator is so good, and there's different elements and things in the audio that enhance the experience. So in this one, we are following Maggie Chase and Ethan Wyatt. They're both authors. She is the queen of cozy mystery, and he is big time thriller guy, and she absolutely hates his guts. He thinks her name is Marcy no matter how many times she's told him otherwise, but when they both accept a cryptic invitation to attend a Christmas house party at the English estate of a reclusive fan, neither is expecting their host to be the most powerful author in the world, Eleanor Ashley, the Duchess herself. Eleanor Ashley is basically like Agatha Christie, and she has invited all of these different authors to her house for one particular reason, and then a mystery develops, and it is so fun. I was so thrilled to find out this was about books, writing, and mysteries, and it was the perfect blend, in my opinion, of like Christmas cozy festiveness, but also romance, sweet, funny, banter, romance, and then thriller, mystery, fast-paced elements. I felt like it blended them really good. It's such a quick-paced novel, and I loved the ending. It was just charming and fun, and it was just such a great time. So even if you don't love Christmas reads, I would still recommend this one. It's not like overly Christmassy. It's more about the romance and the mystery, but there are festive elements in here, and it was just such a great time. I had an absolute blast with it, and I'm so excited it made the list. All right, these last three are my top three of the year. So we have Map of the Otherlands by Heather Fawcett. This is book 2 in the Emily Wilde series, which Emily Wilde I think was tied for my favorite book of last year. I am completely obsessed with this series. I love it so much. So I don't want to give this one away, so we'll talk about book 1, but in book by Heather Fawcett. This is book 2 in the Emily Wilde series, which Emily Wilde I think was tied for my favorite book of last year. I am completely obsessed with this series. I love it so much. So I don't want to give this one away, so we'll talk about book 1. This is an adult cozy fantasy that is incredible. Such a great series. So in the first book, we're following Emily Wilde. She's kind of a curmudgeon professor, and she travels far north to study fairy folklore, and she stumbles upon some dark fae magic. She is the expert on studying fairies, a genius scholar, and a meticulous researcher, writing the world's first encyclopedia of fairy lore. But she is not so good at people. She prefers the company of books, her dog, and the fair folk. She arrives in this hard-scrapple village, and she has no intention of befriending the townsfolk, nor does she care to spend time with the new arrival, her dashing and insufferably handsome academic rival, Wendell Bamblebee. She's in this town and she's writing this encyclopedia, so you're also getting stories of the fae and like cliff notes during the actual story of her doing this, which I love. You got these little fae stories that were very unique because there's all different kinds of fairies. There are some that look like humans, there are some little itty bitty ones, there's like troll-like fairies and all different things. Lots of magic and things, but very easy to follow. So much coziness, such a good one for wintertime, and one of the sweetest, cutest, most adorable romances ever. Like, I loved it so much. Not a spicy read at all. Just cozy fantasy goodness with some romance in there and ridiculously charming characters. So the second book taking place after the events of the first book, and I found it almost more charming. Like, I loved them both so much. I'm fully attached, and I'm so excited for, I think, the third and final book coming out in the end of January. Oh, and once again, the narrator that does these books is phenomenal. She is so enchanting. I remember listening to the first book and even kind of giggling at certain parts because she just captures the characters so well. Next, we have Wisteria by Adeline Grace. This is the third book in the Belladonna series, which I have raved about for the past 3 years now. Such an epic series. So good. So in Belladonna, we are following Signa, and she believes that death has like followed her everywhere she goes. Her parents have died, and she feels like she can see his presence and talk to him, and she wants nothing to do with him. And she doesn't know why he seems to be following her around. When her aunt dies, she winds up having to go live with some long lost relatives in this big manor, and she gets there, and everyone's kind of grumbly and upset because the mother has somewhat recently died, the matriarch of the family, and it seems a little bit more nefarious than what everyone wanted to believe. And so Signa kind of sets out to solve this mystery and figure out if she really died of an illness or if she was possibly murdered. But we also have death as a main character present. There's some magic present because Signa seems to have some magical ability. There are tea parties, there is romance, there's gothic ghost story, mystery, cozy, fantasy goodness. So good. So the second book, we still follow some of the characters from the first book, but we also focus more on 2 other characters. That kind of continues on with the third book. So just kind of be aware, if you love the characters in the first one, they're still there, but they kind of take a back seat to 2 new characters. So just be prepared because all the characters are so easy to fall in love with. And the story continues on in the third book. There's even some kind of wintry elements in the third book that make it like extra cozy. It's just so beautifully written and so magical and lovely. I feel like if you like things like Carval and One Dark Window and you haven't read Belladonna, like, you absolutely must. The narrator for this is so good. She is luscious and dark and romantic, and she will just suck you into the story. I will say it did take me a little bit when I first read it to get into it because it does read a little bit slower in the beginning, and I've had 3 other friends tell me that too. But once you're like in the story, which doesn't take that long, you are in it and you are just gobbling it up, absorbing it, and just enjoying the ride. So good. Love them all. I think Foxglove, the second one, is my favorite, but I really loved each book, and I am so excited because she's writing a Christmas novella set in this world following some of the characters. You do need to read these first before you read that one, so just beware. So excited because that's coming out next year, and I just cannot wait to see the cover and just, oh, I love it so much. Top read of the year, and you guys, this might be my current favorite book of all time, or at least in my top 5 favorite of all time, is The 13th Child by Aaron A. Craig. I was anticipating this one so much. It was almost my most anticipated. It did not disappoint at all. So this is a YA gothic fantasy. So Hazel wasn't like the rest of her siblings. She is the 13th child, promised away to one of the gods. She spends her childhood waiting for her godfather, Merrick, the dreaded end to arrive. When he does, he lays out exactly what he has planned for Hazel's future. She will become a great healer known throughout the kingdom, and to aid in her endeavors, Merrick blesses her with a gift: the ability to instantly deduce the exact cure needed to treat the sick. But all gifts come with a price. Hazel can see when death has claimed a patient, and when all hope is gone, she is tasked to end their suffering, and is also haunted by the ghosts of those that she has killed. Her destiny brings her to the court to treat the king. I don't want to say too much more because you just need to read it. You just need to go into it and read it. There is so much depth to this book. The cover is so perfect for this book. It is just so incredible. There is some romance in here, but that takes a backseat to the overall plot and the magic system and the world, which is just so beautifully written. It is gothic and darker, but not really scary. Again, we have kind of similar vibes to House of Salt and Sorrow, her other series, kind of similar to Belladonna with like the atmosphere and the vibes, and I just didn't want this book to end. Once again, narrator was just absolutely phenomenal. She just made the story even better, which wasn't hard because the writing was just so good. Erin A. Craig has solidified herself in like my top favorite authors of all time. So excited for her next one next year as well. I seriously cannot recommend it enough. It just warmed up my soul with how well written it was, how good the gothic fantasy vibes were, and just how much I was attached to the outcome and the characters. The ending was phenomenal. I feel like the ending of this one and Wisteria are tied with how good they are. So please go read this if you haven't already, because I'll be talking about it nonstop pretty much from here on. Okay, you guys, so those are my top 10 favorite reads of 2024. Overall, we had a pretty good year. I was very impressed with how much I enjoyed the new releases in 2024. They were just done so well. I liked so many of them. Very excited for the new year. Stay tuned because we have a couple more end of the year videos coming your way, and I have a lot of videos coming to you straight away starting January 1st, so stay tuned for that. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss any future videos. Make sure you follow me on Instagram at The Bright Side Girl if you haven't already. I post a lot of bookish and other fun content on there as well. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you're enjoying this weird in between Christmas and New Year's week, and I will see you guys next time on The Bright Side very soon.